this unfortunate and frankly tragic incident of the killing of the three hostages will increase the pressure. We've seen that from the families of the hostage members. The question becomes, though, and I think where it's a bit of a challenge for the Israeli war cabinet, is what that trade would look like.
And all eyes on Israel. Protests have taken place in Tel Aviv hours after the Israeli military admitted that it had mistakenly killed 3 hostages who had been abducted by Hamas and held in Gaza. The IDF apologised for the shooting, saying that the troops had misidentified the 3 as being threats. Benjamin Netanyahu described the deaths as an unbearable tragedy. Now, some relatives are very, very angry. Some have demanded that new negotiations begin with Hamas, saying that they didn't believe the government line that the best way to save hostages was by military means. Well, let's dig into all of this. Joining me now is Jonathan Panikoff, who is the director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative, and he's also a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East, and that was at the National Intelligence Council. So he's somebody very much steeped in security and intelligence. Jonathan, welcome to the show. Good afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's just start. I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think has actually sort of happened with the tragic killings of these people. The IDF has said that there had been a building with SOS marked on it. Many people are saying, how did they not realise they were holding white flags? What do you think's happened here, Jonathan?
Look, so I think the reality is it's going to take a little bit of time. There'll obviously be a very thorough investigation. That's obviously critical. I think part of this just comes down to the fog of war. I cannot imagine IDF troops doing anything to put hostages in harm's way, given the situation as it is now, given how impactful they knew it was going to be to all of society. The reality is, I think sometimes you hit the fog of war, troops go in, and I think, frankly, you have a commotion that sometimes you have an unbearable, frankly, but tragic mistake like this. I think answers will come. My guess is even when they do come, they will be unsatisfactory. The anger is understandable and palpable in Israel. I've spoken to people this morning. It has really just increased the intensity of the people and frustration quite a bit. But I think to know a real clear estimation of exactly what happened is probably going to take some time and a thorough investigation.
And you've mentioned, and we've been reporting on Times Radio, that there's a lot of anger from within Israel about how this has happened and why this has happened, particularly from the families. But there's also, a sort of a growing sense of unease about Israel from international quarters, as well from the diplomatic community. We've heard that, America's feeling quite uneasy, although they have continued to support Israel at those big votes in the UN Security Council, but we know that people are starting to feel quite kind of nervous. Is this all going to put pressure on Netanyahu and the IDF to change its strategy?
I don't know that you're going to see the IDF change its strategy. So the plan has long been to go from what's now a phase 2 operation, which means you're having full battalions, ground troops permanently stationed in Gaza to fight part of this conflict, and then eventually transition to a more counterterrorism-like strategy where you're going to see Israeli troops basing in Israel and going into Gaza 1 to probably 3 days at a time for very precise targeted strikes. The question of when that transition happens, I think, is where the tension has been right now, at least between the U.S. and Israel. We saw Jake Sullivan in Israel earlier this week. He talked about this. The U.S. wants that transition to happen sooner rather than later, because it would probably mean a big decrease in aerial bombardment, which would almost certainly lower civilian casualties in Gaza. Israel has pushed for a slightly longer time frame. I think that will happen, but it's going to take some time. I think that's different than what you're seeing from a broader international call for a complete ceasefire, which I think both Israel and the U.S. have said, look, really is not possible. A ceasefire right now, a permanent one, fundamentally leaves Hamas in charge of Gaza and there's nobody to provide the Israelis with security. So I think that's really the condition that we're going to have to work through in the coming months.
And look, I mean, I think a lot of people are also, I mean, there's some people asking for a full ceasefire. There's a lot of people asking for a humanitarian ceasefire. And there's some truth in the argument that actually, when there was that humanitarian ceasefire, that was the point at which Hamas did release a number of Israeli hostages. Is there not going to be more pressure on Netanyahu not to have a complete ceasefire? I understand that's a difficult topic for him right now, and for understandable reasons. But isn't there going to be renewed pressure on another humanitarian ceasefire to see, they could get the bulk of the remaining hostages back?
Yeah, a humanitarian pause, as it's been called here in the UAS, a humanitarian ceasefire, as I think you're correctly calling it, it is certainly possible. I do think that the pressure is ratcheted up. I think the unfortunate and frankly tragic incident of the killing of the three hostages will increase the pressure. We've seen that from the families of the hostage members. The question becomes, though, and I think where it's a bit of a challenge for the Israeli war cabinet, is what that trade would look like. In other words, you're going to have a humanitarian pause to try and get more hostages released. When does that happen, and what is the trade? Are there enough women and children left that Hamas is going to release them? Hamas has said some hostages are dead. It's not clear if they're honest about that. We know there's some hostages held by other groups. I think there's a real question of trust that obviously doesn't exist, and doesn't even exist with the Qataris who are mediating this, to figure out the parameters of another humanitarian pause for a hostage exchange,
Sure.
because it will be more complicated than the previous one.
Although, I mean, the last one, even though everyone was very nervous about it, I mean, I don't want to use the word successful because, given the context, there's nothing successful about this situation. But it did actually, it went as kind of planned.
It did. And look, it was extended, which I think does show
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the minimal context of what you're talking about when we talk about success. I think you framed it absolutely correct, but it does show it can be done in a way that both sides are getting what they've demanded from it. But I think now you're at a bit of a more challenging point because there are fewer hostages. Is Hamas going to be ready to release the men? Is it going to be ready to release IDF soldiers? I think those are real sticking points and challenging questions. And part of the problem is fundamentally, Hamas may be okay with a ceasefire, but the ceasefire is really for the Palestinian people and the hundreds of thousands of innocent Gazans stuck in the middle. Hamas has stores and stores of food, of water, of fuel that they use for themselves. So it's not as pressing for them as it is for the Palestinian people, and frankly, as it is for the families of the hostages who are stuck in frankly, the most tragic place you can imagine.
And look, Jonathan, how do you think this is going to pan out over the short term? Because what is clearly being picked up is, a real kind of sense of concern, particularly coming from America. There was rumors floating around that senior American leaders were kind of privately saying, look, this can only go on for another couple of weeks. Israel has a huge amount of international support. And after the atrocities of the 7th of October, there was a huge amount of solidarity for Israel. There is an anxiety that support is waning as this conflict goes on. How do you think this is going to sort of pan out? Are we still going to see this level of bombardment from Israel into Gaza for like the next 6 months? Where do you think this goes?
Yeah, no, I think this gets to what Jake Sullivan was doing in Israel. I think you probably have what the U.S. has said. They want to wrap this up in weeks. The Israelis have said you need another couple months. My guess is you have somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks of frankly heavy bombardment, forces on the ground, and then you see a transition to what I'll call a counterterrorism strategy, where you have much more precise strikes, much less aerial bombardment, where you see the Israeli reservists actually probably leave active duty, return to Israel, because one story that's not being talked about is the unbelievable damage this is understandably doing to the Israeli economy, because you've lost so much of the workforce. I was in the Middle East last week, and I have to be honest, I think much of the Arab Arab world has long been since ready for this to end. I think that any solidarity, frankly, with Israel has long since ended, and that pressure is only going to increase in the coming weeks.
That's a really interesting point about the damage that this has done to Israel's economy, and of course, as you say, to the wider region. And I'm sure many people in the region sort of actually just want, forget the sort of taking sides, but actually want their economies to be functional again. Jonathan, a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time.